talk about all things law life on this channel. Today I want to talk to you about blogging for lawyers. I have had a blog now for about 10 years, close to 10 years, at michelledavis.com.au, and I love blogging and I can understand why a lot of people like it too. Now, if you are looking at doing a blog, or perhaps you've been asked to write a blog post for the law firm website, you are totally in the right place. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why I choose the cases that I choose and how I go about approaching that case when I write a blog piece. So the first thing is, I don't really spend an awful long time writing a blog post. I try to keep it really, really short and succinct. I think the most time ends up being about actually reading the case and maybe reading it more than once too, to be honest. But firstly, the reason I pick a certain case is usually just because I find it really interesting. And so I think when you're starting out blogging, I think that's definitely something that you should really focus on, because if you don't find it interesting, chances are your audience isn't going to either. So first and foremost, if it's interesting, go with that one. Now, the other aspect I look for is a recent case, because it's modern, it's something you can relate to now, and you can just really demonstrate how the law is always changing and why that's important. The one thing I really focus on when writing a blog piece is the fact that I am a storyteller. I start with the facts, and the facts are to set the scene for the actual legal decision that's being made later on. And so the biggest thing I always stick to is the fact that I'm talking about real people, and particularly this is something I suppose that's really quite important in terms of the work that I do, because I'm working in wills and estates, and I'm literally talking about often people's loved ones who have passed away, or perhaps a dispute that's arisen after that, and it's really quite a contentious one, and you're talking about families and, you know, falling outs and all sorts of things, and that is a real life thing. And so I think it can be easy for us lawyers to forget that, because we're so detail orientated in the law that applies and the decision and how it's actually come about and the court's decision making process. But when you're talking about blog pieces, you've got to make sure that you remember that people are actually reading this stuff, and not just lawyers. In fact, it could be the parties themselves that are finding it on the internet, and that can be pretty darn confronting. So I implore you definitely just to make sure that you keep that front of mind when you're writing about these cases. And even in the commercial sense, because some people can get quite offended, and understandably so. No one wants their dirty laundry out in the world, and it's bad enough that it's in a legal decision that lawyers will read. But if you're putting it on a blog, you're making it a little bit more public for them. So just keep that in mind. My best advice, I think. When I'm writing a blog post, I stick to points. So particularly in legal cases, there's obviously the points and principles of the element of an offence or a civil claim or that kind of thing. You're always going to speak to those, but you end up in obviously going to the ratio of the decision. You're talking sometimes about the overtar, you're thinking about the other peripheral things that might be applicable to the case that you're dealing with, so you might want to speak to them. It really just depends on what the end result of the blog is going to be, and that comes back to my one of my last points is the pinpointing the summary of the decision. What makes it interesting in the first place? Bring it sort of around to the end there, so that, you know, maybe you're quoting a particular passage from the decision from the judge that really kind of honed in on the outcome, the resolution, or the conclusion of the decision itself. But I think the one thing that people often forget about in blog writing for law firms and things like that is bringing it all together at the end by saying why it's interesting. What made you think of that decision? Why do you want to write about it at all? What makes that case so interesting? And what is the main takeaway for your audience reading it? Like, are you writing it for your clients? Usually so, I suppose. So the thing is, you want to think about, okay, well, what do you want that client to take away when they finish reading that piece? If it's for other lawyers, perhaps you're a barrister and you want to write more stuff for the lawyers to see what kind of specialty you're in. You know, what do you want those lawyers to take away from, so that you are staying front of mind when that person has a matter that they think they need your help with. And so you kind of just bringing it all around in a nice sort of succinct package, I suppose. And that's, I think, one thing that a few blog posts are lacking. So I absolutely recommend you just bring it all home, with a few key points and a few key takeaways you want your audience to walk away with. The other thing is I also usually keep it to around, well, I try to keep it around to the 500 to 1,000 word mark, and that can be a bit tough. I totally appreciate that. And I guess the difficulty is how much do you want to give information out at risk of taking away the fluid nature of the piece itself. You don't want to lose anyone. You don't want to bombard it with all the paragraphs of quotes from the judgments or anything like that. You want to try and avoid that if you can. Now with my blog, I guess it's mostly lawyers that read it, and it's usually written for lawyers. So I tend to get chunks out of the decision for that reason, to bring home the ratio or bring home the key point that stood out for me. And so that's a little different. So if you are wanting to use a blog post for that, documenting your case notes or something like that, that's a cool way to do it, because that's what I use it for, and I still find that I'm looking those up even now. But yeah, trying to keep it fairly short and succinct is the key. And always, if you're writing for lawyers, link the case so that they can look into the depths of that case further. And that's a really important part, because as you know, you can read a case for one purpose, and then years later that same case might come up because you're looking at something again, but from a different purpose, because there's so many things a case can deal with in one. So you might want to go back to that case for a different purpose later on. So having the link there is super helpful. So that's my little spiel on blogging for lawyers and how I go about blogging for case law in my area. And look, I think the principles can apply to any type of area of law. So give it a go. If you have, please pop a comment in the comments below, and I'd love to see your work and support you in some way that I can. So feel free to share that. But until then, we'll see you in the next video. See ya.